Hello, everyone, and welcome to Spilling the Tea, the podcast where we explore the stories behind the technology shaping the future of privacy. I am Lisa Louth from Secret Network, and I will be your host today. This show is all about the real world applications of confidential computing and AI, how TEs are being used to solve complex problems, to protect data, and unlock new possibilities for individuals as well as enterprises. And we're not just talking theory, we're sharing the journeys, the challenges, and the breakthroughs from the builders on the front lines. Today's guest is someone with a fascinating perspective. I'm very excited to introduce Andrew Smith, the co-founder and CEO of Hivello. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, how you going, Lisa?
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, Andrew has 10 plus years working in blockchain. He previously co-founded Banksa with his co-founder Dominic, who's also the co-founder of Hivello. Banksa, of course, we all know, grew to the second largest fiat on-off ramp in the world, working with big names like Binance, KuCoin, OKX, and MetaMask. So we're thrilled to have you here today. Andrew, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got here?
Oof. I don't know if we have enough time in this episode. It seems like I've been doing this forever. It's been about 11 years now. I think I started in December 2013 was when I first started working. Yeah, it seems like in blockchain, that's almost, 60, 70 years, I think, in real world years, going back that far. And I remember, at the time, being introduced to Bitcoin and, thinking, I think maybe I've missed the ship on this one. Maybe the ship's already sailed. I might be a bit late to this one in 2013, and to look back now, and it's just laughable, really. The 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 thought that I would think that at the time. But yeah, my experience has always been in very small startups and scale ups. So working in technology businesses, web-based mostly, and some mobile, and scaling them up, and working with a team of founders, and exiting is usually been my kind of core skill.
Amazing. What can I ask you? What drew you to Bitcoin the first time?
Yeah, it's I always have a really funny answer for this, because it's not one that I've really come across myself, just talking to others. But what really got me interested in Bitcoin, and you have to remember, this is, as I said, the end of 2013. So the world looks a lot different to how it does today. But what really got me interested in Bitcoin, when I first was exposed to it, was the facts that it was essentially programmable and scriptable. And what I mean by that is, I was always kind of annoyed at the fact, coming from working in smaller companies, in small startups, that when you wanted to kind of interact with financial services, unless you were I guess what you would call in the US, like a Fortune 500 company, or a very large multinational, you know, y- the banks typically didn't want to speak to you. They didn't want to interface with you. They didn't want to give you the kind of tools to be able to do kind of, um, uh, let's say, programmatic kind of banking and financial transactions. And here came along this technology, which was open source and open for everybody to be able to, no matter how much was in your bank account, you could write software on top of this technology, and that's what really got me interested. Today, it does look a little bit different. We've got, a whole wave of fintechs that have kind of come into the space since then, and tried to really break down those barriers in the traditional financial services. But it still doesn't beat the kind of decentralized and open source nature of not just Bitcoin, but all of the other, amazing blockchains and projects have come since
Hmm.
then.
It's interesting the way you describe your attraction to Bitcoin and thinking about banks, where it really operates on the threshold between traditional finance and decentralized finance, doesn't it? So that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, I was gonna say, one thing, the thing about, Banksa that really sort of, um, was the key or the driver for us starting that was, uh, uh, in at that time, sort of 12 years ago, to buy Bitcoin in Australia, if I guess if you didn't already tell from my accent, but that's where I come from originally, but to buy Bitcoin in Australia meant sending, a wire transfer to an exchange offshore somewhere, like Mt. Gox in Japan or, Bitstamp in Europe. And, sending a wire transfer 12 years ago internationally meant paying a huge amount. I think we paid something like 30 Australian dollars, which is probably equivalent to maybe about 20 US dollars, just to do that transaction. Plus, the bank would probably, pad the exchange rate by 3 or 4%. So, it really was a very expensive kind of endeavor. And then you would have this waiting game of like, waiting 3 or 4 days for it to kind of clear overseas. And, you know, if you send $100 or $200, maybe you can afford to kind of lose that. But when you're running a business, and especially a startup, when every kind of dollar counts, and you've got your entire, let's say, float just sitting there in the ether, waiting for it to land or not, it could be very, very, very nerve wracking in that kind of
Indeed.
environment. Yeah.
Yeah, so you address the pain points really that you were experiencing.
Yeah, yeah, just really trying to make it, firstly, yeah, local and acceptable in, local payment methods was our kind of really our point of difference, I guess, to the rest of at that
Yeah.
time, yeah.
Yeah, it was very much needed. So, going to the topic of our talk today, can you walk us through your experience with TEEs in the context of helium? Just what worked and what didn't as you started this journey. I mean, TEEs are next. Obviously, we're in a different world today. It's not about buying Bitcoin so much. It's more about making things on chain that are usable for the real world rather than totally transparent. And I'm just wondering, like, your journey with TEs, how did you come to it and how what was your experience getting up and running?
Yeah, yeah, sure. It's interesting for me is because I was traditionally always working on the software side of technology. So hardware for me was quite new when we started Havello. We started in 2022, so about 3 years ago now. And as you mentioned, helium was our first deep in, our first exposure to TEEs and other kinds of hardware technologies. And I guess the backstory was helium had originally started, and I should probably preface for your audience if you're not familiar with helium, they're a decentralized Internet of Things data network. So essentially, a network built by users setting up a hotspot all around the world to build out a Internet of Things data network. They've since also added 5G in the United States, so they're now IoT and 5G data in the US. Um, but essentially, a network, a data network, much like your own, phone, a cellular phone network connection, but powered by people setting up hardware in their, house, in their apartment, in their office, as opposed to, a big corporation setting up hardware in around the world. Um, and Helium started with a device you could buy off them or a do-it-yourself device that you could put together with a Raspberry Pi. Um, the problem I think that Helium experienced was the the sort of cat and mouse game of trying to authenticate whether a device on their network was actually a bit of hardware at the other end or was somebody spoofing a device. And that's where they decided to I guess uh, change their model of a little bit and work with manufacturers by installing a little a little TE module into essentially soldering onto a Raspberry Pi. And that was my first ever exposure to that kind of technology. It was was for me. It was obviously a learning experience, but it also made a lot of sense as well. Um, how you could do authentication on these decentralized networks using these chips.
What specific problems did you run into when you soldered on these TEs, when you used it for device authentication?
Yeah, good question. I mean, first, there's the learning curve, I guess. There's obviously for working with new technology, it does require that kind of learning curve. I think the I think the the main kind of issue with the way that this was kind of implemented was using a technology that wasn't very well uh, let's say wasn't very well known or very well understood, um, meant that uh, for helium users, they really, there was really only the ability to buy hardware from a certain specific set of manufacturers that had access to, the tooling and I guess, the fabrication required to be able to install this one chip into this one type of Raspberry Pi. And I think, the problem with that kind of approach was really, it doesn't make sort of mass market or wide adoption, very possible in that kind of let's say model. And I think that's uh, even today, that's a problem for a lot of deep ends is, how do we authenticate devices on our network to ensure that they're, actually who they say they are? Um, you know, do we work with a specific set of manufacturers? And if we work with a specific set of manufacturers who can provide devices with TEEs installed, um, my philosophy is kind of, is it truly decentralized? If you say you can only work with, this person, this person, this person, it kind of centralizes the decentralization, if you know what I mean. Um, and and of course, what happened during that time was COVID and the big chip shortage around the world, where even the largest car manufacturers in the world couldn't get enough equipment. So I think a little startup is going to have very little chance to be able to get their hands on that kind of equipment. And so what you saw there was really people handing over, 300, 400, $500 for a device that they were expecting to get delivered the next month, and then 6 months later, 9 months later, it still hadn't been delivered. Of course, nobody anticipated that supply chain issue there, but that was the next, that was the next kind of problem that that just sort of, articulated through there.
S So, I mean, that kind of, was a little bit of a barrier, but, uh, m more recently, you've been, more interested in TEs, and I'm just wondering what made you start paying attention to it again?
Yeah, I think Deepin still has a long way to go in terms of combating um, the bad actors in the space who are trying to essentially spoof devices on these networks. Um, I think it's just the nature of. Unfortunately, it's the nature of the world that we live in. Is when someone says, here's some, if someone's, or it says perceives some money out here, then someone's going to try and do what they can to take it, without paying for it. Or yeah, so I think deep ins have a lot of 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 um, way to go in actually working on their authentication methods, and I think TEEs are probably the best answer to that problem at the moment. And I think it's really a huge potential for TEEs, and I see a lot of value in it. To be frank, Lisa.
Well, how are you addressing the issue with the limited number of manufacturers who can produce the required hardware?
Yeah, for us, we're focused on mostly on software. Our application is a desktop application, so we're not so much at the moment focusing on the hardware side of it, but we're in the process of we're running a project internally at the moment, which is looking at how can we use different authentication methodologies to improve our own application to be able to authenticate um, on chain and on network. And TEs, depending on the even the your general home hardware, whether it's like an Intel processor, some are actually there is uh, some how do I say um, uh, even home computers are having that ability to be able to use specific TEs, and we're looking at all these different types of technologies to expand our own. Yeah.
Are you aware of the movement to create an open source TEE?
No, I'm not actually, but I'd love to hear more.
It's a very interesting project. It's who's running is Poet Society, and it's a group of people. It's not a company, but it's supported by a number of different companies, including Flashbots. And the research, I know some of the researchers who are working on it. It's a very aspirational project. I think the challenge is when it comes to hardware, it's difficult to make an open source hardware solution that is practical in the real world because it takes so many resources to build hardware to manufacturing. And so how are you going to make an open source TEs? So there are some big headwinds against it, but I'm just wondering if there were such a thing, do you think that would be a good solution to the challenges?
Yeah, I think so. I think most, probably if I was going to take a guess, maybe 70, 80, 90% of the software that's powering the kind of networks that we're integrated with is all open source. I think there's a um, uh, uh, I think for a lot of um, blockchain projects, because of past bad deeds, let's say in the space, you're guilty until proven innocent. And I think the open source software movement is a way of saying, hey, here's the software that we're working on. You're free to go look at it, look at the code. So I think anything open source in this industry is almost the default, really, in a lot of ways. I definitely see that kind of I definitely see that kind of approach working, and something that you touched on about the usability, or the ease of use for the end the end consumer. That's really important for us at Havella, because our target market really is users that are not so who are interested in blockchains and decentralized networks, and want to get involved, but aren't, say, at the technical level, like a software developer can set different nodes up themselves and run them. So we sort of fit into this space where people who are, we sort of say, crypto curious, but maybe don't have the technical knowledge to set up the nodes and whatnot. That's our kind of target market, and and our application really automates and orchestrates a lot of the very difficult kind of processes involved in this. And so for us, if we say to a user, we need you to go into your BIOS, restart your computer, go into your BIOS, enable this TEE, setting. Um, that's probably a stretch too far for us at the moment for our user base. So we really look for technologies that uh, uh, are simple and almost seamless, I guess. Seamless is probably the best word to use. It's seamless for the end user, so can really be utilized without them actually having to know all of the hardcore kind of tech going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and have you seen any promising implementations of TE that address those problems with usability?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, nothing, nothing that comes to my mind right off the top of my head. I think it still is a I think it still is a technology as far as I'm aware. As I said, my experience has only been a couple of years worth, which is probably, compared to the people at Secret, is probably very very junior. But I still feel like the technology is in its infancy, and still has a long way to go to be really kind of well understood and sort of usable by the general kind of population. Much like the software that, much like Deepins and a lot of blockchain, it's still, it still feels like it's in its infancy.
Yes. Well, it sounds like you're pretty pro TEEs, Andrew, but I'm just wondering, are there any other approaches to device authentication that you've come across that are perhaps promising as well as TEs or maybe more reliable?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. More reliable or promising? That's a great question. I mean, with a lot of Deepins, public and private key authentication is kind of the default at the moment. Using creating up spinning up essentially a key that can be used as a wallet as well as an authentication kind of method. Um, I really like the approach that Nasana, which is an AI based deep in. Essentially, as a user, if you want to, um, uh, you know, run an AI model training container, you can essentially renting a GPU like you would rent it from AWS or Google Cloud. But instead of it being in a data center, it's a network of people contributing their GPUs. I really like their approach because they have really put the entire end-to-end experience on chain, which is um, I'd like to say quite unique compared to a lot of deep in projects are still quite, how would I say, some bits are on chain, some bits are off chain. You don't quite see the end to end, fully. But with Nasana, they've really, I think, done an outstanding job of flowing the whole from creating a job, training the model, finishing the job, checking if the job was correctly undertaken by the person at the other, or the party at the other end, and then settling the payments all on chain, which I think is just fantastic. And I was just reading before I jumped on, and you have a partnership with Aethia, I believe, which is a similar kind of, yeah. And so this is where I think this part of uh, um, uh, I think this is a very um, uh, uh, how would I say, a very uh, small part of the deep in environment, but a very important part is to authenticate these devices and make sure that they're actually
Mm.
doing what they say they do.
Yeah, it's kind of the linchpin of the whole
Yeah.
thing, isn't it? So if our listeners want to learn more about what you're building, where would you send them?
Yeah, well, we're obviously we're online at hivello.com. You can also we're quite active on X/Twitter, depending on which you want to call it. Still at Hivello Official. Also our Discord and our Telegram. But yeah, I would say go to hivello.com. Download our app; it's free to use. Right now, we've essentially we've just integrated our 10th deep in. So yeah, we're doing really well. It's been a really exciting journey.
Amazing. Well, I learned so much from these sessions, so I really appreciate your time, Andrew. It's been great talking to you and learning more about what Havello is building, more about helium, and I look forward to seeing what you guys are going to do in the coming years.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Lisa. Thanks for
Thank
having
you
me.
for being here.